And welcome back, everybody. Welcome again to another complete set presentation. I thought this would be a good time because of the football season winding down and moving into its second season, the postseason. It would be a good time to pull out another football complete set and talk about another one from my childhood. This one's probably going to be a little bit more stories about my childhood experience with this set, more so than anything else, because this is one I actually collected as a child and features many cards that I had from a kid as well, which is different than many of the sets I collected for baseball, which I had since replaced as adults. So this will be a fun set to go through, and I'll talk a little bit about the 1987 NFL season as well as I go through the set. And I'll try and point out some of the stars and Hall of Famers that I'm aware of, although football is not my major sport, so I probably will miss some of the football Hall of Famers, and for that, I apologize. And this will have a heavy Bears focus, for sure. All right, so the 87 Topps design, it is a 396 card set. Also features a series of 1,000-yard club members, both rushers as well as receivers, that were one per pack. You get them one per rack pack, one per solid pack, and also one per wax pack. Those were the three ways the cards came. This was a set where you could actually buy it as a complete set. I don't think I remember seeing these as retail, so I actually bought all these cards for wax packs, retail cello packs, and rack packs back in the day. The card itself is a very simple design. I think one that's still pretty popular to this day, given some of the players that are in the set. Obviously, this is a Jerry Rice. I have a graded card that I picked up recently this past year from old Candlestick Park. You can see that it was still set up for the Giants at this point when this game was played, because it has the dirt infield on the field. But anyway, very simple design. Have a banner at the top with the team name. If the player was part of the Pro Bowl, it also mentions it on there. Position at the top, followed by their name. That's also on a banner. The back of the card is going to be this red card. It's a little bit of a lighter red here that's almost like a pink tone. Stats on the back. It'll have a complete stat line if the player has one, except for some of the offensive linemen and defensive players. Sometimes they chose not to do that and just did more narrative on there. And then a little bit of bio on here as far as like date of birth, where they're from, what college they attended, etc., etc., and obviously the number of where the card falls in the set. As with most of the top sets of this era, they're organized by where the team finished. So it's not alphabetical order, but unlike baseball, they're not randomly inserted in there. It's actually going to be sorted by team. All right, with that said, let's jump into the set itself. Starting with the 1,000-yard club leaders. You can see right at the top, you have Dickerson and Jerry Rice. Walter Payton's down here in the corner. This was the last set that had a regular issue Walter Payton card. 88 did have a record breaker card in there. Kurt Warner, the running back. Not the same as the running back, as we all know. The backs of these are bright blue and has each individual game as well as their stat line for that game listed on there. Up here you have some players from the Redskins who actually were the champions this season in 1987. This season is remembered for two things in particular. One being the replacement players. The two players were on strike during this time, and they actually had NFL owners had recruited players to cross the line, even though most of these guys were not part of the NFL union, so they had replacement players play, I think, for like the first 6 to 8 games of the season, if I'm not mistaken. And then they had the NFL players beginning to start crossing the lines, and they finally figured out an agreement, mostly because people didn't want to watch this brand of football. It was sloppy. The ratings were going down. They wanted to see the professionals, so they eventually worked it out. And actually, this has been in labor peace for this sport ever since. They've never had a stoppage that impacted the season since that time. Steve Larchin down here. And the second thing that stands out to me is this was the first season that a black quarterback won the Super Bowl. So that's a really cool moment in NFL history. And hopefully, I think he's actually featured in this set. I think Doug Williams is actually in the set. If not, he's in, obviously, 88. Chris Collinsworth. Up here, Art Monk. All right, now we're down to the set itself. Usually started with the first card featuring the Super Bowl result from the previous year, followed by record breakers, and then it goes into the set itself. For the 86 season, the Giants beat the Broncos in the Super Bowl, one of Elway's first losses before he started winning the Super Bowl. Steve Largent and Dan Marino featured up here as well. Dan Marino had consecutive seasons with 30 or more touchdown passes, was a record as of 1986. Man, things have definitely changed. I'm sure that's been broken. And then Donnie Shell, part of the Steel Curtain, was still playing at that point. And Charlie Joyner up here, most receiving yards career. That has been blown away since then. He's also a member of the NFL Hall of Fame. And we got Phil Simms here. All right, the Giants, they were the champions previous year. So we got starting with the Giants, following the Broncos, and then moving on to the other playoff teams. Phil Simms mentioned again. I think the Giants of this era are remembered probably more for their defense, even though they had some good offensive players too. But it's easy to remember for your defense when you have players like Harry Carson and Lawrence Taylor featured in it. And we got on to the Denver Broncos. John Elway up here in the corner. I think this is his 4th year card, if I'm not mistaken. I got a lot of these wax packs back today. I had tons and tons of these cards, probably more so than 86. I had a lot of 87 football and 87 baseball. This is probably the height of my collecting, maybe 88. But this is where the height where I was collecting both sports. We got my Chicago Bears. They were a playoff team again in 87, but they were bounced out after their first game because they lost to the Redskins. I believe it actually was a home game for Chicago, and they lost that game. Yeah, they lost 21-17. Yeah, Walter Payton, Doug Flutie. I don't think this is rookie cards. I think he's actually part of the USFL set too. Dan Hampton, Jim Colbert, Steve McMichael. Not a Hall of Famer, but one I think all Bears fans are hoping at one point will be in there. He's actually not faring well in his health these days. It'd be nice to see him get in while he's still alive. The Fridge, big star of his era, Richard Dent, Otis Wilson, Mike Singletary. A lot of these guys are part of the 85 Bears, and just as still a very special team to this day in this area because the Bears haven't won Super Bowl since, number one, but just because of the feats they accomplished during the season that they won. They're probably also known for a team that probably, in a sense, a little underachieved too. They did have the capacity to maybe win more than one, but that just wasn't how it worked out for them. Here we go. We got the actual team that actually won the Super Bowl from 87. And it actually does not have Doug Williams. I stand corrected. It has Jay Schroeder as their quarterback. Gary Clark and Eric Monk, good receivers for them. Joe Jacoby, very good lineman for them. Charles Mann, I remember kind of being a beast. Dexter Manley too. Darryl Green, hell of an athlete and Hall of Famer. Probably still could outrun a lot of guys in their 20s and 30s. Now on to the Browns. Browns also made the playoffs again in 87. They lost to Denver in the AFC Championship game after beating Indianapolis to get there. Ozzie Newsome, Hall of Famer. Bob Golick, the older brother of Mike and Mike Golick. The Patriots did not return to the playoffs in 87. I think they were a playoff team in 86 as well. Now we got San Francisco. San Francisco did make the playoffs. They lost to the Minnesota Vikings in their first playoff game. Minnesota won 2 games before losing to Washington in the championships game for the NFC. So they were just about to come into their greatness in the late 80s here, even though I think they'd already won a couple at this point. But this is when they really got good, when they had Jerry Rice and Joe Montana hooking up for a lot of the scores. Montana, Craig, Rice. Big names in their history. Ronnie Lott, hell of a player in the backfield, as well as Charles Haley at the line. Got the Jets. Jets were not a playoff team. It won't be this season either, unfortunately, for Jets fans. Klecko, that's a name I really remember for a while. Can't imagine playing on the artificial turf of that era. So many teams did, though. You have the Los Angeles Rams. Eric Dickerson featured again there. Got Kansas City Chiefs. Their uniform hasn't changed much over the years. As you get further along the set, there's less cards per team. That's a theme with these top sets from this era. We got Seattle. Steve Largent up here in the corner. We get on to Cincinnati. I'm sorry, Seattle was a playoff team. I forgot to mention that. They lost in the wild card game to Houston, which would be the Houston Oilers at that time. We got Boomer up here, Chris Collinsworth, big time announcers now. Anthony Munoz, Hall of Famer. At Minnesota, as I mentioned, they won 2 games and lost just by a touchdown to Washington, did not make the Super Bowl. They've missed out on the Super Bowl really quite a bit in the last 30, 40 years. Have not won one either. Maybe it's this year. Now, they were a big pain in the Bears' heels and during this time period because the Packers weren't good. The Lions weren't good. It was really just the Vikings and Bears battling for the division kind of during this era. But it was really the Bears, during this era. They really didn't have much competition. Marcus Allen. We have the LA Raiders. Funny, they've been 3 different locations. I had to make sure I got that right. But they were Los Angeles this time. Howie Long up here. Then we go down to the league leader cards. They have 1 from each league, starting with the passing leaders. Tommy Kramer's a name I would have forgotten if I didn't own these cards. Passing leaders, Jerry Rice is featured there. Rushing leaders, we got Dickerson again. Scoring leaders, we got Kevin Butler on there, Kevin Butthead. Interception leaders, we got Ronnie Lott featured on there. And we got Miami. Dan Marino, obviously the big name on that team. Also kind of an underachieving team during his time, even though he was a great quarterback. Maybe the best to never win the Super Bowl, possibly. It's debatable, but I think he's right up there. You have the Falcons. You have the Cowboys. This was a underachieving era for the Cowboys. It was right before they got really bad, before they got really good. Probably still the biggest names on here are stars from their previous era of dominance, meaning Tony Dorsett. Herschel Walker is also featured in this one. This was his rookie card. It was a big card at the time. Everybody wanted it. Obviously, where the Cowboys really benefited from Herschel Walker is when they moved him on and got tons of draft picks that resulted in them becoming a great team. The Saints were a big story this year because they kind of came out of nowhere and made their first playoff appearance. I remember watching them qualify. I think they played the final game of the season. I think at that point they did it on Monday night. They had Monday night games to feature the final game of the season. And it was maybe on New Year's Eve, I think, when they did the game. I could be wrong. Don't remember who they played, but I think they won on like a last-second field goal or something like that and got into the playoffs, and then just got hammered by Minnesota. They lost 44-10, but it was a pretty cool story. That's time. Morton Anderson, Hall of Fame kicker. Kicked forever. Here we got the Steelers. Definitely were just a shell of their once great teams. A few good names still left from the Steel Curtain. Lips and Stallworth, meaning I'm sorry, not Lips, but Stallworth being one of them. Gary Anderson, I don't think was on those teams, but he was definitely a great kicker for his era. Johnny Shell was during that era. Okay. And we got the Eagles, Philadelphia. Cunningham, big rookie at that time. He was a running, throwing quarterback, and he was African American, which was groundbreaking in many ways for the league. Kind of really paved the way, if you will. He and a few others really paved the path for what we see the NFL is today, which is just a great brand of athleticism that was kind of missing from that position because it was already really great throwers. We still have those players, but I like the variation that we see at that position now personally. And I think the audiences of NFL does as well. But he was a big one. I remember when he got injured, I was watching that game when his knee, I think he blew out his knee against the Packers when the Packers would play some home games in Milwaukee's County Stadium. He got hurt there. Wasn't quite the same player after that, but did go on to have some good seasons when he joined Minnesota. And I believe that for a time hooked up with Randy Moss, if I'm not mistaken. And we got Houston. It was another big story because they started going on a little bit of a run of being a playoff team at this time. Couldn't get over the hump, but had a couple good seasons where they were trying to get in the playoffs. Before, obviously, they later moved to Tennessee, which happened later on in the following decade. But we have Warren Moon featured here. Houston actually won a playoff game. They beat Seattle. They won the wild card game, but were later lost to Denver the following week. Mike Childress was a good name at that time. Here we go. We got the Lions. Now we have the St. Louis Cardinals. I think this was before they moved to Arizona. They're still playing at Busch Stadium. They moved right around this time, if I'm not mistaken. And we got the Chargers. Dan Fouts towards the end of his career. Then the Green Bay Packers. James Lofton, probably the biggest name on that team. Achieved some greatness once he left the Packers, but had some good seasons with the Packers. Like greatness in the sense of he was able to be on some winning teams. He definitely had some good numbers before then. I always thought this card always stood out to me because it has a different color for his tab. It's probably an uncorrected air. It's probably the best way to look at it because they don't have a yellow version of it. So it's kind of interesting seeing this card because it doesn't match up with the banners that you see for the player names on the rest of the cards. And I think it's the only one in the set that's that way. We got the Bills. This was as they were starting to build their great teams. Don't think maybe the following year they may have broken into the playoffs, but I'm not sure. But in '87, they were just starting to improve, starting to put that team together. Jim Kelly had joined the team at that point. He was just getting hammered at that point because they didn't really have a lot of protection for him. But you had Andre Reed that was already on the team. Bruce Smith was already there. So they were starting to build up the team. We got Indianapolis. Not too many memorable names on here. And we got the Buccaneers. Probably a memorable name on here is Steve Young. think this was when he got traded to the 49ers, because you have it mentioned down here in the bottom. It says now with the 49ers on his card. This is his second NFL issued card. It does have a USFL rookie, which is much more expensive. And they were the last team featured because they had the worst record from '86. You see the 3 checklists that are listed here. So that is the 1987 top set. Washington, again, won the Super Bowl that year and did it handsomely, too. They won 42-10 over Denver. I think this was a year where we thought, you know, Denver is the better team. But, man, they just had it handed to them. And that was held at good old Jack Murphy Stadium in San Diego back in the day, probably in January of 1988. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope you come back and watch the next upcoming set that I'll do, probably starting in February. I'll return to baseball. And we'll have some more content later this week. Have a great week, everyone.